Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Robin Budish. I'm the Executive Director of Transit Choices. We hold monthly meetings, and it is our pleasure to have you join us today. Our mission is to advocate for an equitable, efficient, safe, and reliable public transit system for the Baltimore region. And each month, it is our pleasure to bring to you key transportation leaders and spokespersons to talk about important and relevant information with respect to the public transit arena. So in that regard, it is my pleasure to introduce our first guest presenter, Delegate Mark Edelson. Mark represents the 46th District. His presentation is titled Maryland General Assembly 2024 Session Around Transit Update. So Mark, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Robin. Great to see you. Great to see everybody. This is, I'll say this off the record for a second, Daniel, probably my favorite place to come and present because I just love issues of transit so much, but don't tell anybody else that you're my favorites. It's great to see you all. It's great to see you all this morning. I've been up since around 5 a.m. with my son, so hopefully you can't see any bags under my eyes, but I'm always energized to come talk about transit with all of you. So let's dive right in. It was a interesting, fascinating, fun, intense session, particularly on issues of the budget and transit, which was, the area that I really want to be most focused on. And so I very much enjoyed being able to dive so deeply into those issues, especially in my second session. Just a little bit of context for anybody that doesn't know, I sit on the Appropriations Committee in the House, which is the Budget Committee. Our sister committee in the Senate is the Budget and Taxation Committee. And my subcommittee assignment is that I sit on the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee, which is frankly a dream assignment for me because those are the issues that I really want to be focusing on. And shortly before session this year, I was informed that the speaker had appointed me as the vice chair of the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee. And so that was really an incredible honor and a responsibility that I take extremely seriously. Through our subcommittee, essentially, we have overview and oversight of all of the agency budgets that impact transportation and the environment. So that's MDOT, that's the State Highway Administration, that's MTA, that's the Maryland Transportation Authority, which is the tolling authority. That's the ports, that's the airport, that's the Department of the Environment, that's the Energy Administration, that's the Public Service Commission, which is the agency that oversees our utilities. All of these agencies present their budgets to us in the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee. And then towards the end of our budgeting process, we then make recommendations to the full committee with respect to each of those budgets as to any modifications, additions, subtractions we think that should be made. And then that gets voted on by the full committee. And then, provided it gets enough votes in the full committee, it then goes to the House. And the full House of Delegates then votes on each of the agency budgets that then combine to make our state operating budget. The same process happens in the Senate through the Budget and Taxation Committee, and then it goes to the full Senate. And then just a little sort of civics 101, to the extent that there are differences in the versions of the budget that the House and the Senate pass, those documents then have to go to what's known as conference. And each chamber assigns a number of conferees to have those negotiations to try to reconcile the differences between the two budgetary documents. In addition, when you have a budget year like we had this year, in which we had a contraction in our state revenues as a result of a number of factors. We could probably talk for hours about why our state revenues went down. I think one of the clear ones is the federal COVID-related dollars that we've been getting sort of ran out this year. So that sort of tranche of money that we've been getting ran out. Specifically on the transportation side of things, so much of those projects are funded by gasoline taxes. And we have seen less gas taxes coming into the Transportation Trust Fund recently, which on the one hand, as we all know, is a good thing because that means that less people are driving gas-powered vehicles as a result of new practices in terms of work, a lot of people working from home, but also because people are moving away from gas-powered vehicles and into EVs, et cetera, which is great for the environment. But it does mean that we have less money in our transportation trust fund to do all the projects that we care about so deeply. And so when you have less revenues coming into the state budget, that means that we have less money to put into the programs and the commitments that we've made to Marylanders. And so we had to make some very strategic and thoughtful investments and decisions this year in the budget. And it also means that there's a document that will go along with our state budget, which is known as the BRFA. That's the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. And that's sort of a sister document to the budget that's necessary when we're going to make changes to previously mandated spending that we've had in previous years. And so this year, our state budget was about $1 billion less than it was a year ago. And so as a result of that, we needed this BRFA document. And there was disagreement between the House and the Senate on exactly how we should make these investments and these decisions in the BRFA. And so then the House and the Senate each appointed 5 conference members to have these negotiations. And I had the immense honor of being one of the 5 House conferees appointed to be in the negotiations with the Senate on the BRFA, which, as a second-year member of the House, was something that I frankly didn't expect to be appointed to. But I absolutely enjoyed every minute of it. I got to really see sort of the behind the scenes of how the budget negotiations work and play a role in it. And my focus really was on transit and on the city. And, that was sort of my lane, so to speak, in the BRFA negotiations. And so that was an opportunity that I had this session. And ultimately, the decisions that we landed on and the compromise that we reached, I think, is an excellent one. And I'm really, really proud of the budget that we passed. And I have to say, in my opinion, one of the huge, huge winners in this year's budget is both transit and the Baltimore region, without a doubt. So specifically, just looking at some of the numbers, we were able to allocate and program about $230 million. That'll rise up to $330 million in new money into our transit system through this year's budget process. And we also have listed in the BRFA document sort of a waterfall of priorities of where that money is to go as it's being allocated and programmed by our different state agencies. And so the number one location that it's supposed to go is to highway user revenue. As I'm sure many of you know, highway user revenue is essentially state aid to our local jurisdictions that is then used specifically for transit and transportation related stuff. That's the money that we use to fix our roads and our bridges and our highways and do transit investments. And specifically for the city, this is the primary source of dollars that we have that sort of funds the budget of city DOT to do things like capital improvements and investments in the city. And in 2008, 2009, during the Great Recession, that pot of money was cut by about 90%. And this was obviously a catastrophic loss to the city and to the region. The expectation was, and the strategy at the time was that when we got out of the recession, sort of those levels would be restored and brought back up to where they were in pre-recession times. What happened next was that Governor Hogan was elected governor and decided not to restore that money to the highway user revenue pot. And so we had a good decade and a half of extremely low levels of highway user revenue. In fact, I have some of the numbers that I wanted to mention to you. So in 2000, and this is sort of specifically as it relates to the city, but in 2005, 2006, 2007, it was approximately 200 to 226 million in highway user revenue that would come to the city for operating and capital dollars for the programs and projects that we need specifically through city DOT. In post-Great Recession, that number dropped to about 120 million. So about 100 million a year that the city has lost out on. And that number stayed the same through pretty much 2019. So, you figure that's about 10 years of 100 million, that's $1 billion that has not come to the city for highway user revenue. And, we don't have SHA in the city. The State Highway Administration is essentially the agency that fixes the roads and bridges and highways everywhere else in the state. But because of the deal that was struck back in the 1960s, the city's primary source of funding for that kind of work is through highway user revenue. In 2018, the legislature passed a bill that did increase highway user revenue numbers. And in 2022, passed another bill shortly before my time that was set to increase the numbers pretty substantially. And the fear this particular session, because of the decrease that we'd seen in our state revenue, was that we would see some catastrophic cuts again in highway user revenue. And this would be sort of right at the time that, city DOT has finally been given a real budget to do capital improvements. And as we know, transportation planning takes time. You have to hire people, you have to engineer, you have to design, you have to program, you have to plan. It's not something that you can just turn on and turn off. And in order to make those kinds of investments, you have to know that the money is coming for a number of years, or else you don't want to start a project and not be able to finish it. And so those are some of the challenges that we've seen. And so for the potential for that money to be there and then all of a sudden be slashed again based on the revenue challenges we've been having was, very scary. But I am very happy and excited to report that because of the budget that we passed this year, we are going to have that money there for city DOT. And so just looking at the numbers, in FY23, and these are, projections because it's 23 and 24, we basically have the numbers, but 25 onwards, this is based on, it's all percentages, right? So ultimately a percentage of the total gas taxes go into what is the HUR fund, and then a percentage of the HUR fund goes to each particular jurisdiction. And so it's all based on the attainment, how much gas tax revenue, et cetera, comes in. But the projections, at least for 2023, is that the city got around 170 million in HUR. In 2024, the city is projected to get between 200 and 210 million. In 25, the city is going to get around 240 million. In 2006 and 2007, around 275 million. So, that's a big step towards finally having a real capital budget at DOT to try to make the improvements in both operating and capital that we need in our city roads and bridges and highways, and to be able to do things like build the Greenway Trail network and the bike lanes and all the accessibility that we want to see throughout the city. So this was a huge, huge session for those issues. Another area that the funding is to go to is the LOTS program. That's the locally operated transit systems, which is, if you think in the city, that's the Charm City Circulator and the Harbor Connector. In the county, that's the Towson Loop. In Ocean City, that's the Ocean City Beach Bus. These are local systems that are funded through MTA that provide people critical options to get from where they are to where they need to go. And it's done by each jurisdiction. And that program hasn't really had a dedicated pot of funding either for a long period of time. And so it's very difficult for local agencies to really program that money without knowing that it's going to be coming for the long term. And so having that at the top of the priority list is a great thing in our budget, as well as it's sort of a great equalizer. I mean, I'll just say one of the bills that I sponsored this session that we were able to get passed was HB 950, which is a bill that mandates a certain level of funding specifically for the LOTS program. And so prior to now, there was no mandated amount of funding that would go to that program. Now we're going to have a minimum of $80 million a year starting in fiscal year 26 that is going to the LOTS program. And, throughout the course of the passage of that bill, it was amazing to me to see the diversity of geographic support, of political support for that particular piece of legislation. I mean, I'm a legislator in the city. I want this to be done for everybody, but also my focus is on things like the Circulator and the Harbor Connector. We got letters of support from St. Mary's County, from Ocean City, from Hartford County, from, all over the state. Red jurisdictions, blue jurisdictions, didn't matter. Everybody uses this program, and it's a real great equalizer. And so it was great to see the support that came in for that bill and for us to be able to ensure that we're going to have this level of funding for it going forward. And then the other major place that the money is going to go is to MTA. So it's going to go to MTA for operating to make sure that we can hire and retain the operators that we need to have our buses and our trains run on time. It's going to go to critical system preservation needs that we have at MTA to make sure that, you know, we're making the investments in the maintenance and upkeep of all of the of our MTA fleet, which, by the way, dovetails nicely with the HUR money, because, you know, when the city is not able to maintain its roads and bridges and highways, then that also puts extra stress on the MTA fleet that's using those roads and puts those vehicles into a state of worse repair. And so us being able to actually maintain our infrastructure in the city and be able to put money into MTA's fleet is absolutely critical. And so us being able to put those two together in the budget this year was so important. And then the final place that it's going to go is to continue design and engineering of the Red Line, which is, you know, as we all know, an absolutely critical transit piece for the entire region, one that was taken away from us by the prior administration, and one that the current administration has really committed to getting over the finish line. And frankly, that's thanks to so much hard work from everybody that I see on the screen right now. And so the fact that we're able to maintain the pot of money that's going to go to design and engineering of the Red Line, as well as our current systems, because when we make our application to the federal government, to FTA, for the billions of dollars that we're going to need for the Red Line, one of the top things that they're going to look at is how are you running your current system? You know, before we give you money for a shiny new toy, how well are you operating and maintaining your current system? How reliable is it? How well are you getting people where they need to go? What are your system preservation levels, et cetera? And so for us to be able to say, look at the
Mark?
Guess you ran out of revenue.
Yeah, Mark,
Yeah, I'm back.
did
Sorry.
you see the chat? Yep, you froze. Okay, you're back. Great, thank you.
Do you happen to remember the last thing that I said, so I can remember where I was?
You were talking about when you apply for funding, for example, for
Oh,
the Red Line, you
got
know,
it.
that they're going to look at a series of criteria.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, that is so important. And so when we apply for the billions of dollars that we're going to need from the federal government to make the Red Line happen, one of the top things that they're going to look at is how well do you operate and maintain your current system. And so for us to be able to say we're making these long-term investments both on the city level, in our roads and bridges and highways, and also in our city transit systems like the circulator, and then also at the MTA level, to maintain our fleet in a state of good repair is going to be so important for that application that we make to the federal government. And so that's why, you know, I'm so proud of the sort of holistic approach that we took to our transportation dollars and to the budget this session, specifically looking ahead at all the investments we want to be making in the system for the city and for the region, frankly, for a long time to come. That's why I say this was such a great session, both for transit and for the region, particularly on those budget issues. And so that's sort of my session kind of budget wrap up. A couple other things, as I mentioned, we were able to pass the lots bill, which was HB 950, which is going to mandate 80 million in funding for the lots program as a minimum level from fiscal year 26 onwards. I also sponsored a bill focused on the MTA mobility and paratransit system. You know, what we've heard from folks is that that system is not as reliable and efficient and on time as it needs to be. And for our folks that are relying on mobility, you know, those services are getting them to the doctor, to dialysis treatments. It tends to be often older folks, and we have to make sure that we're focusing on those folks and that they're getting the best possible system and reliable services. And so we're going to do a study at the Maryland Transportation Institute, which is at College Park, our flagship institution, to determine whether it would make more sense. Because right now that system is largely run by third-party contractors. The question is, would it make more sense for us, both from a quality of services and from a financial standpoint, to bring that system internal to MTA and have our mobility system run internally? So that was another bill that we got passed that I'm very proud of. I passed a number of other bills, but they're not specifically on transit. So my thought is I'm going to keep this focused on transit. And then the final one that I want to discuss, although I see Brian and Miguel, who are here to talk more on this one, is on the TCA. That's the Transportation and Climate Alignment Act, which we were so close to passing. It was literally up next in the Senate on sine die. I was sitting, so let me give a little bit of context. The purpose of this bill is that, and I see Lindsay as well. Hi, Lindsay. The purpose of this bill is to require MDOT to do an assessment of any major highway expansion programs and to deter projects that expansion will result in increased greenhouse gas emissions. Because obviously we have
Marcus,
gas emissions, conducting projects that are inconsistent with those goals, then we're not doing. Have I frozen again? Sorry.
you're unfrozen, so you're back. Please continue.
No, sorry about that. I don't know why my Wi-Fi isn't working. Maybe someone's trying to silence me. Who knows? I'm just kidding, Daniel. You don't have to put that in. Anyway, so the idea is that we need to be making investments in transit and in transportation planning that's consistent with our climate goals. And so I'm going to let Miguel and Brian and Lindsay talk much more about that. But we got the bill passed through the House. We had it through both committees that it needed to get through in the Senate. It passed second reader in the Senate. And then it faced some stiff opposition in the Senate right at around 11:30 p.m. on sine die. I was actually sitting in the House with my laptop open, voting on bills in the House, watching the proceedings in the Senate at the same time to see if we could get it over the finish line, but we just didn't. I guess that's why they say don't get married to your bills, because you never know what's going to happen. We are going to bring it back next year, and hopefully we'll have success at getting it over the finish line. So I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has, or Robin, if you wanted to jump to Brian and Miguel on their presentation, totally up to you.
Actually, this is a great time to open the floor to questions and comments. I would like to kick off the Q&A session by first, sincerely congratulating you and your colleagues for all of your hard work, dedication, and commitment to pass the budget. We know that it was extremely challenging. My question is, we recognize that there is much more work to do. So all of, the wonderful individuals on this call today or participating in the meeting are all transit enthusiasts, advocates. And what can we be doing, to assist your efforts and those of your colleagues, right, to really get the funding, the full funding that the Baltimore region needs moving forward?
That's a great question. And thank you so much, Robin, for saying that. The way that we were able to get the budget passed this session that we did was thanks in significant part to the advocacy and organizing and lobbying that you all did, both on an individual level with particular members who were able to move the needle and on a collective level. And I would say it's going to be the same thing next year. What we cannot do is look at it and say, okay, we made great strides this year, and so we're in a good place. Yeah, we're in a good place, but there is so much more work to do. And what we've been able to do this year is really bring this energy and this focus on the importance of our transit and transportation system around the state. There were so many conversations about it this particular session. We've opened so many people's minds around the state to the critical importance of this issue. What we have to now say is, let's take the next step, next session, and make sure that we can ensure that we have a fully sustainable system for a long time to come. Because at the end of the day, one time, this is sort of what we said at the start of session when the governor made the $150 million one-time infusion of cash into the system. The sort of message was, that's great. We recognize the importance of that, and you do too, and that's awesome. Thank you. But if we don't ensure that this funding is going to be there for the long term, it doesn't necessarily get us where we need to go, because for our agencies to be able to plan and program this money and hire talent and retain that talent and be innovative and creative in how we think about the future and getting people where they need to be, we have to know that the money is going to be there for the long term. And so I just think we have to stay organized. We have to have that fire in our belly. We have to be ready to do the one-on-one interactions with legislators and members of the administration. And we have to be able to organize in a big way. We have to bring diverse coalitions. I mean, I have to say, one of the things as well that I think was so effective this session was that the people making the argument for these investments weren't just the transit people. It was the economic development folks. It was the public health folks. It was so many different sectors of society who will benefit from a high functioning transit system. We're also making the argument. And as a legislator, I can just tell you, when you have that diverse a coalition of people saying a top priority, you have to listen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Robin, can I ask a question?
Sure, Jimmy.
Mark, would you speak a little bit about the Train Commission and the BRTC Commission and what timeline they're on to make their recommendations to the legislature?
Yeah, totally. Thank you, Jimmy. So, you know, the Train Commission is essentially the Blue Ribbon Commission that was set up in the 2023 session to look specifically at our current state of play with respect to transit and transportation funding in the state of Maryland, and thinking about, you know, creatively, what are other states doing? What are other places in the world doing? How can we solve this challenge that we have, that we simply do not have enough money coming into the system to fund the current commitments that we have, never mind the big picture future stuff that we want to do, like the Red Line. And so that's really the focus of the Train Commission. It made some recommendations to the General Assembly prior to the start of this session, you know, a number of which we took, and that's how we were able to add money into the system. And, you know, for things like prior to now, we haven't really had any kinds of fees coming in on electric vehicles, right? And so for gas-powered vehicles, when you go to the pump and you pump gas, you pay gas taxes, and that money comes into the system. But for electric vehicles, that wasn't the case. And so, you know, one of the recommendations that the Train Commission made is we need to start bringing in some revenue from our electric vehicles. And so these are the kinds of things that we've been discussing. Some of the other discussions were about increasing the tolls, both for in-state and for out-of-state drivers. That we did not pass, but that is also something that the administrator but the Train making recommendations to the General Assembly prior to next legislative session. So that's going to be critical. Jimmy, am I losing you guys? Am I breaking up a bit again?
You're back.
Apologies. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why my Wi-Fi is having issues. And then the BRTC is critical too. That was a bill that was passed in 2023. And that was Tony Bridges, you know, at the time, Delegate Tony Bridges that sponsored and got that bill passed. And that really creates a commission to focus on advocacy, discussions, organizing, and a forum and a platform really to talk about transit and transportation issues for the Baltimore region. That's the Baltimore Region Transportation Commission. And so it's many of the people in this room are commissioners on it. John Laria is the chair, and he is, you know, exceptional on these issues. And so that is another great place where we have, and frankly, the BRTC was very effective this session in being able to have a forum for people like Administrator Holly Arnold to come to, and I know she's come to Transit Choices as well, and said, look, this is what the current state is of MTA. This is what our needs are. This is how we get to where we need to go. And this is why we need your support and advocacy, and why we need the General Assembly to make the investments that we did this session. And so those are also two critical pieces of the puzzle that allow us to really get the message out to Marylanders in general as to what the current state of our transportation system is, and the TTF, our Transportation Trust Fund, which is the central pot of money that all of our programs are allocated dollars from. And then also how we think about making that system more sustainable in the future.
Thank you, Klaus.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I agree with you. We dodged the bullet this year, and what came out is pretty good for transit. And however, it's not sustained because the $150 million that came back are largely out of the rainy day fund. And so next year it will be all back to the same question with these cuts that the governor had originally proposed across the board. And so there is one particular point that I take issue with, which is this narrative that the gas tax is not working anymore because we have decreasing income. And I just looked at the table of gas sales in Maryland between 2009 and 2023, and it's basically exactly at least constant, and it's not going down. And so then we had the increased taxes that we have since O'Malley's legislation. So there should be increased revenue. And so the story doesn't quite jive, even though I understand in the long run we do need to have more innovative revenue generators. But I think we are falling for some kind of trick by the gasoline industry here, because really, when we want to transition to electric vehicles, then we should not punish electric vehicles by putting new charges on them. Rather, we should punish gasoline usage. And so my question to you is like, how you personally see that, and for the next year, I mean, a really short-term quick fix would be an additional increase in the gasoline tax. And this is not a social hardship because everybody who wants to can compensate for those increases with buying more fuel-efficient cars.
So, I mean, that's a great point. Look, the fact is that at the end of the day, our gas tax revenues are not keeping pace with the investments that we want and need to be making in our transportation system. I think we can agree with that. And so what we have to think about is we got two options, right? We either find a way to bring more money into the system that will allow us to make the investments that we all know we need to make, or we make cuts. And what we don't want to be doing is making cuts in our transit sector right at the time when we're looking to expand it and provide highly reliable services. The question of will adding fees onto zero emission vehicles disincentivize people from purchasing those vehicles was studied at length by the Train Commission. We've looked at the other states that have done it, and in those states, it has not disincentivized people from making the transition to zero emission vehicles. The other thing about it is those cars are also driving on the roads. And so they're adding to the wear and tear on our roads, and the money that comes in to our Transportation Trust Fund goes to the repair and maintenance of our roads, among other things. So as a simple notion of fairness, I think everybody has to be contributing that's driving a car on the roads, whatever the way that car is powered, to ensuring that we're able to upkeep and maintain our roads in a state of good repair. In terms of the notion of increasing the gas tax, I am always open to that discussion. I think politically it's going to face some pretty significant headwinds, as well as I would just say, the initial infusion of cash from the governor of the $150 million from the rainy day fund, et cetera, that was a one-time infusion of cash. But the budget that we passed with the additional $230 to $330 million of new money coming into our Transportation Trust Fund, that's not one time. That's continuing. That's going to be every year. That's why it rises to 330 over time. So that money will allow us to make investments that we need to be making. And a big chunk of that money comes from the increase in fees, registration fees on the heavier vehicles. And so those are the heavier vehicles based on the axle size of the vehicles that are also going to be, using more gas. And so we're certainly attuned to, the impact that some of our heavy vehicles have and the fact that they, use a lot more gas, and making sure that those folks are paying their fair share. In terms of an increase in the gas tax, that might be a harder one, to get through right now, Klaus. But, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page that the money that is coming into our transportation system as a result of this year's budget is not one time. That's continuing money. That will be an additional 230 to 330 to 50 million every year.
Thank you, Delegate Edelson. We'll have to move on from here, but what I would like to offer to all of the meeting participants is if you have additional comments or questions for Delegate Edelson, please put them in the chat. I will make sure to share them with him following this meeting. So thank you again.
The other thing I'll do is I'll put my email in the chat as well. I meant to do that. So if anybody has additional thoughts, comments, concerns, you want to grab a coffee with me and chat transit, Klaus, we can have this conversation for hours and hours if you want to. I'd absolutely love that. We can do that going back to 2015. I'll put my email in the chat. So great to be with you all. Thank you so much for having me. Most importantly, thank you for all of your dedicated work towards having a high functioning transit system in the state of Maryland. It's so important.
Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our second guest speakers, Brian O'Malley, who is, the president and CEO of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, and Miguel Moravec, who is a senior associate with RMI, the US Program. Their presentation is a Maryland bill to align transportation spending with climate goals. So Brian and Miguel, welcome.
Thanks. Robin, I'm sharing my screen. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing, and do you see the presentation view or the, are you seeing my whole screen?
I'm seeing, let's see, the slides to the left and the main, the main slide on the front. There you go.
Now we're in presentation mode. Great, Brian.
Better. Yep.
So I'm gonna try to move quickly so we have time because there's a lot of good content here. Thanks, it's an honor to follow Delegate Edelson. So this morning you get to hear from a legislator, and then I'm wearing the advocate hat, and then Miguel is a policy analyst. And Miguel and I are gonna do a deeper dive on one of the bills that Delegate Edelson mentioned that he sponsored, which was the TCA, or Transportation and Climate Alignment Act. And we are going to talk about this bill that, as Delegate Edelson said, came so close to passing and that he intends to bring back, and there's a coalition of folks working on it. We're focusing on this one because we really believe that it's important to the Transit Choices vision, and so we think this is right up your alley or right in your wheelhouse to pay attention to a bill like this, and I look forward to telling you why. I'm going to say what the bill does briefly because Delegate Edelson already touched on it, and I'm going to say why we think it's important. And I'm going to hand it over to Miguel, who has done a lot of very interesting analysis of what the benefits would be for Maryland. And he's also followed closely what's happened with similar efforts in other states. And then it'll come back to me to tell you about the coalition supporting it and how you can get involved. So what the bill does is, as the delegate said, is it requires MDOT to analyze the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions anytime that they're planning a highway expansion project of a certain size. So if MDOT wants to widen a highway or road, they have to study what impact it will have on greenhouse gas emissions so that we can track progress on climate goals and set targets towards working towards those goals. It's important because we are seeing unprecedented amounts of money coming from the federal government to states. This photo is from November 2021. President Biden was signing into law the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's also sometimes called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, and I'll refer to it as the IIJA here. It did a number of important things, but there's two that I want to highlight for you. One is it sends a lot more money to states for transportation than the federal government previously did. And two, it sends it with few strings attached. So it gives states a lot of flexibility, a lot of latitude in how they spend those funds. And so that raises the question, okay, if states have so much flexibility with these IIJA funds that are coming, what will that do for the climate crisis? Georgetown Climate Center did an analysis right off the bat as soon as this law was signed to figure out what does this mean for the climate crisis. And their finding in December of that year of 2021 was we found IIJA could be an important part of the US response to climate change. It could lead to more greenhouse gas pollution than the trajectory we are currently on. Where the actual outcome falls within that range will depend on the decisions made by state, federal, and local governments about how to spend the money made available by the IIJA. So we have our work cut out for us. We need to make sure that Maryland spends these funds in ways that help the climate crisis, not make it worse. So a few years in, how's it going? This is a story from February in The Guardian. US spends billions on roads rather than public transport in climate time bomb. So I think it's safe to say it's going quite badly. In fact, worse than the Georgetown Climate Center's worst case scenario when it modeled how the results of this new funding could play out. Why? Because, as the first sentence of the article says, roads, roads, and more roads. The states got all that federal funding and they're spending it on widening roads and highways. The vast majority of it on widening roads and highways. And that is increasing greenhouse gas emissions. It's increasing pollution from car and truck tailpipes. How's Maryland spending its funds? Well, or actually, excuse me, I want to say why it's very important in Maryland because we have set a goal to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2031. So Maryland is taking the climate crisis seriously by setting this target. And we know that the transportation sector is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland. And that's primarily emissions coming from tailpipes of cars and trucks. And we also know from our own Maryland Department of the Environment in its recent climate pollution reduction plan that adoption of electric vehicles alone will not be enough. Reducing how much we drive is necessary if we're going to meet our targets. So how's Maryland doing with the spending of these federal dollars? This is analysis by Transportation for America, which was also the basis for the Guardian story. And this pie chart represents how Maryland's been spending the IIJA funds. And you can see the large yellow wedge is for highway resurfacing, so that's good. We're fixing what we have. But the large reddish orange wedge is highway capacity. We're spending more on highway capacity, that's widening roads and highways, than on trains, buses, bike infrastructure, and pedestrian infrastructure combined. And that is producing an increase in greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland. So we need to get more serious about how we're spending on highway expansion. We threw it in these slides just to make sure we address the question, is all this spending on highway expansion reducing congestion? A lot of people think that widening highways reduces congestion. This is evidence from nationwide that Transportation for America did. Between 93 and 2017, we expanded lane miles faster than the population group. So we were providing more lanes per person than we had before. And so those of you who may think that widening highways helps alleviate congestion would expect congestion to go down, and let's see what happened. Congestion went up way more than either the lane mile increase or the population. Widening highways made congestion far worse. And that's been the experience in Maryland. It's the experience across all metro regions. It does not alleviate congestion. It creates and generates more traffic. With that, let me throw it over to Miguel to talk about his analysis.
Hey, thanks, Brian, so much. Hey, everyone, my name is Miguel Moravec. I'm a senior associate with the Rocky Mountain Institute and looking really forward to talking with you all here at Transit Choices about some exciting policies we've seen in other states and how that's informed bills like the Transportation Climate Alignment, Transportation Climate Alignment Act here in Maryland. And I also want to share, even though RMI, if you haven't heard of us, we're an international research institute, we're nonpartisan, nonprofit, all of that. I grew up in Maryland. If you're on the Mark Penn line, I was off the Odenton stop, and my family is still in Maryland, so I have a deep connection to, Annapolis and beyond. So let's go ahead and get started. Brian, next slide. So yeah, if you haven't heard of the Rocky Mountain Institute, we were founded over 40 years ago to answer one big question. if we make our energy systems more efficient, what is the benefit to society? Today, we're asking that same question in Maryland about the transportation sector specifically. If we shift to more efficient modes, what would the benefit to society be? And as Brian has made the case really eloquently, the academic community agrees that a lane expansion not only fails to reduce congestion, but because of the fact that for the next 15 to 20 years, we are going to have fossil fuel cars on the road, and expanded highways lead to more of these cars spending more time on the road. This idea of highway expansion has very adverse climate impacts. It's a major lever in driving up emissions, even when you're doing other good things. Next slide, Brian. So fortunately, the Rocky Mountain Institute, we were founded in Boulder, Colorado, and the state of Boulder has a nation-leading policy it passed back in 2021 to require a climate-aligned mode shift with a laser focus on highway expansion. And this bill was in part, what the TCA was looking to replicate. So we're really going to dive into the benefits of this Colorado policy and how it's been implemented and all the great things that have resulted. Next slide, Brian. Okay, so what does the Colorado Greenhouse Gas Planning Standard do? It basically, answers this question of you can't manage what you don't measure. So in the state of Colorado, they're now required to forecast the new traffic and new emissions from highway expansions. And if they find that the new forecasted traffic, including all of those fossil fuel cars that are added to the roads, is not climate aligned, they're required to mitigate, to shift investments into projects that we know reduce traffic and therefore reduce pollution. So that includes things like bus rapid transit, bike lanes, and so on. And what we'll do next is show you exactly, after passing this law, how the state of Colorado met its climate targets after measuring the new emissions. Next slide, please. So after passing this policy, what perhaps is most impressive about the Colorado Greenhouse Gas Standard is that they passed it and it had teeth, resulting in the shift of over $1.5 billion away from 2 Denver highway expansions the state found would not be compatible with climate goals. And they took that same money and put it into a plethora of multimodal solutions. So that meant actually creating an entire new office at the Colorado State DOT to develop 5 new bus rapid transit corridors. They took $900 million of that shifted money and put it into expanding bike, walk, and transit networks. And then they also worked with local partners to update assumptions about transit-oriented development and smart growth strategies that bring destinations closer together, by definition, reducing traffic and helping the state stay climate aligned. So, as someone who's watching these types of policies across the nation, this is what we consider the gold standard of a climate transportation policy with teeth that actually gets at the issue of highway expansion cranking up emissions in a way that defeats, maybe cleaner and more affordable transportation investments. Next slide. Something else really impressive about this policy, yes, it was going to, make the state of Colorado climate aligned in the transportation sector. Great. But the state of Colorado also commissioned a cost benefit analysis of this policy. And they found that between now and 2050, their commuters would save over $40 billion of net benefit, primarily from less trips to the pump and less automobile crashes and collisions. So, even if you don't buy into the climate angle, having a more efficient transportation system, go figure, is cheaper for everyone involved. And as you all are very familiar with, automobiles are just one of the most dangerous modes of getting around. So if you expand choices, you invariably prevent car crashes as well, while actually reducing traffic too, which was exciting. So we'll dive more into some of these benefits as we continue on. Next slide, please. But here at the Rocky Mountain Institute, we were really impressed by this policy. We were really impressed by the cost-benefit analysis. And we decided to say, hey, we have this analytical bench What if we expanded that analysis to all 50 states, including Maryland, especially in light of the fact that Maryland was moving TCA? Next slide. And, something that TCA does that's unique from Colorado is TCA set a specific, it codified the vehicle miles traveled reduction goal. In other words, it just says, hey, MDOT, you need to plan our transportation system so that folks have more choices and won't have to be as car dependent. It's something like returning car traffic in Maryland back to 2013 levels, which again, growing up in Maryland, I remember, the world still works pretty well in Maryland with 2013 traffic levels. But anyway, what our analysis really actually does is, it says, hey, here is the MDOT forecast of business as usual. Right now, Maryland DOT is projecting that traffic as measured by VMT is going to increase over 1% annually between now and 2050. We just asked the question, what would the benefits be of instead decreasing vehicle miles traveled by expanding, other transportation choices or eliminating trips entirely? What would the benefits be in that gap between business as usual and expanding transportation choices? Next slide. So as it turns out, there's massive benefits to Marylanders, go figure, by taking steps to ensure transportation planning is climate aligned. And next slide, Brian, we're going to zoom in on a few of these benefits. But first and foremost, this issue is really a kitchen table consumer savings issue. So, using our analysis by replacing just about 1 in 5 car trips compared to present levels with some other mode, whether that's walking, biking, or just logging in on Zoom, that has significant savings even for those who still use vehicles. Because, next slide, if we zoom in on these cost savings, replacing just 1 in 5 car trips means that you don't have to maintain your vehicle as much. It means that you are avoiding depreciation, so that when you go to trade in or sell your vehicle, you have less miles on the odometer, and that leads to direct cost savings for consumers. And then, of course, obviously you're using less fuel, whether you're in an electric vehicle or a gasoline vehicle. And we assume in our analysis, a high degree of EV adoption in Maryland, considering Maryland's EV targets. So, $2,000, $3,000, a year over the time period between now and 2050 is a pretty large stimulus, especially for our most disadvantaged neighbors in Maryland, who can put that money towards essential services like healthcare instead, of transportation costs, which can be a considerable burden on disadvantaged communities. Next slide. Next slide again. Okay, so we just discussed some of these kitchen table savings for folks who still have cars but just don't have to drive as much because you have more transportation choices. I want to get into the climate impact more directly too. So replacing just 1 in 5 trips per person in Maryland would avoid over 55 million metric tons of climate pollution between now and 2050. So that sounds like a big number. I want to contextualize it with the next slide. 55 million metric tons of carbon pollution avoided would be the same benefit of installing over 500 wind turbines, off the coast of, the Chesapeake somewhere, or on the Atlantic, and letting those 550 turbines run for between now and 2050, producing clean energy. So, this is a really large order of magnitude of climate savings. And it's one that can be done without the expensive capital expenditures of like 550 turbines. Next slide. And the last benefit I want to zoom in here that we forecast for Maryland specifically, one more slide, please, was the avoided crash deaths. So, nationally, there are about 40,000 crash deaths per year. In Maryland, that's a couple hundred. And replacing just 1 in 5 car trips gradually over the course of time between now and 2050 would lead to, on average, about 170 less crash fatalities per year. And, really surprising, 2,500 less injuries, or fewer injuries, excuse me, per year. So there's when you ask who the transportation system serves, aligning policy with reducing fatality outcomes is, I think, a really strong motivator for action. Next slide. Okay. So, in conclusion, we here at RMI, we're able to project out the benefits of policies like TCA and say fairly confidently, a more efficient, clean transportation system, not only saves people money, but it helps align Maryland with its existing climate goals and unlocks significant health and safety benefits that are almost difficult to process because they are so large. Next slide. And so it's no wonder, Maryland is not alone in trying to adopt policy like this to shift investments into clean and affordable transportation in a more rigorous framework. And, since Colorado passed, its nation-leading law, Minnesota has done the same thing in 2023. I was really involved in that effort. And Brian's going to dive in a little more about the TCA in Maryland and what happened this session. But I also wanted to flag that New York and Illinois have very similar bills that are going through committee right now. And we're seeing sort of a domino effect of these policies because of that exact unique ability to actually challenge car-centric infrastructure and unlimited car infrastructure spending, and bringing that money and shifting it into the transit and multimodal space. So next slide. If you have any questions about the analysis, want to see the numbers yourself, you're welcome to email me or just Google Smarter Modes. That's the name of our calculator. I'll drop it in the chat. Yeah, Brian, please take it from here, and thank you for letting me present.
Thank you, Robin. I will be very quick. I want to respect folks' time. As Delegate Edelson said, this bill passed the House and came oh so close to passing Senate, but didn't quite. And so we thank our leaders. The delegate on the left in this slide might look familiar if you were paying attention this morning. So to our leaders who moved it. There is a wonderful coalition that worked together on supporting this bill because we all think it's so important. Delegate Edelson shouted out Lindsay Mendelson, who's here. Lindsay facilitates, coordinates a regular Zoom meeting for folks that are working on this. And I want to encourage all of you to consider getting involved as we build strength to bring this back and get it enacted in 2025. You can see here a photo of a rally we did in Annapolis, a great group of folks, some representing large organizations like Sierra Club and some coming as individuals. All are welcome and all are really helpful. I have a video I'm not going to show in the interest of time, but I'll share the link with Robin so she can include it when she sends out the follow-up. But this just shows a Morgan State freshman who came with us and testified, and Senator Corey McCray responding, and it just shows the impact that you don't have to have a huge organization behind you. He came representing himself, and his story was very compelling and really drew the interest of the legislators. And so if you would like to get involved, we have a Google form that we encourage you to fill out so that we can follow up and let you know opportunities to get involved. And I will drop the link to that in the chat. So thank you very, very much for giving us the floor today and giving us your attention. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Brian. May we go back to full screen? Thank you. So Transit Choices is a proud, partner in terms of all of these initiatives. And, we want to express our gratitude both to Brian with the CMTA and Lindsay at the Maryland Sierra Club for their incredibly, hard work and commitment to these issues, climate as it relates to transportation and the successes that they've had. We now have a few moments for Q&A. I apologize, we're running over, but we did start a couple of minutes late. So if you could indulge me, that would be most appreciated. Jim?
I think this was a very good presentation today, and one of the things, though, I constantly struggle with is situational awareness. In our local case, we have the Key Bridge, which wasn't discussed today, and the potential displacement value of that replacement. The other thing I think we haven't discussed is the essential need for speed in our transit system in order to really get people out of their cars. The idea of building any system that doesn't really place speed at a very high priority basically excludes the growth areas of our region, which are outside of Baltimore City, from participation in a regional transit system. And what I mean by that is if we have a system that runs through Baltimore City that doesn't do it quickly, we can't get suburban participation. If we don't have suburban participation where the growth of the population is, we're really ignoring a huge part of our region's needs. I'm not going to go on because I don't really think this is the proper time for me to do that, but I want to raise those points for consideration.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Brian, Miguel, Mark, would anyone like to respond to Jim's comments at this time?
I'm happy to just say, in general, I agree. Jim, obviously the collapse of the bridge is going to be a critical issue for us for many years to come, and happened about 2 weeks before the end of session. I mean, I got a call from the governor's chief legislative officer, Eric Lukey, at about 3:30 that morning to let me know what had happened. And as the governor often says, when you get a call in the middle of the night, it's usually not for a good reason. And so that significantly impacted our work and will for a long time. And I apologize that I didn't make more mention of that in my remarks. I was trying to keep it as concise as I could. But yeah, that's something we need to consider. And of course, in order for a transit system to be high functioning and one that makes, not just riders that have to use the system, but we want choice riders using the system. And so it needs to be all those things. It needs to be quick, it needs to be efficient, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be safe, it needs to be clean. And so for me, that's sort of inherent in the decisions that we make to improve upon and expand our system, that in order to get people to use it, it has to be those things.
Thank you. Klaus?
Well, the Rocky Mountain Institute studies about, VMT reduction and all that really point to the larger question that we really have to face as a society if we want to really seriously attack climate change. It is avoiding growth where we can avoid it, and that is an anathema to most people. Politically, it's suicide to talk about not having growth. But this transportation example shows that when you are changing quantity into quality, which means you don't need as much mobility because you are allocating the land use smarter and you're avoiding trips, or you are making trips in other modes, then that gives us all these benefits that we have. And that would be true for all kinds of other growth too. So I find this very important that we broach this today, and we need to expand that into other areas as well, because that is the challenge, that we need to restructure our society from just quantitative growth into a quality of life approach.
Yeah, Klaus, I really agree, and I'll just comment too. We have reports about land use specifically in growth, where if you just assume, you upzone and allow for density housing in existing residential areas, you can still unlock a lot of these benefits while having, massive amounts of new housing units added to your housing stock. So, I want to say there's still growth is still possible, but it's just about doing it intelligently so that you lead to a higher quality community experience that also is now more dense and can, better fill out a transit bus and make that investment make more sense. So yes, just definitely agree. We are happy to provide those numbers, and I dropped a link in the chat to our blog that dives into more of the issues you were just talking about making a higher quality, living experience, even if none of the climate benefits were real. There's just so many other health, safety, and community benefits to these kinds of approaches. So thanks for your comment.
Well, that will be the final comment to conclude this meeting. And Jimmy Rouse, Transit Choices co-founder, is going to provide the closing remarks. Jimmy?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank the presenters, Mark, Brian, and Miguel. Mark, it's great to have you in the legislature because you can keep us informed on how we can make our advocacy efforts most effective. And so having this relationship, for your information of the people listening, Mark's been a board member on Transit Choices for a number of years. So having him in the legislature and seeing him rise so quickly in the hierarchy is a tribute to his intelligence and being articulate. And we really appreciate the hard work he's doing. And Brian has been a long-term ally in our whole struggle to improve our public transit system. So thank you, Brian. And then I want to thank the audience, because your participation in these conversations is key to us being able to attract good presenters who want to come and present, and to have this kind of incredibly informative discussion that this enables us to have about transportation issues. So by just tuning us in, you are doing a part of increasing our ability to be transportation advocates. And so you're part of that process. So thank you for tuning in. That's all, Robin.
Thank you, Jimmy. We wish everyone a wonderful upcoming holiday, long weekend. Transit Choices is planning its June meeting, so please stay tuned for more details on that. And, just to reiterate what Jimmy said, thank you so much for your participation today, your ongoing interest in our advocacy work, and we wish you a wonderful day. Thank you.